Chapter 1. A Filing Cabinet with Good Hair. The review materialized on his screen, each word a tiny digital stake aimed directly at the shriveled organ he used for a heart. 1 star. Title: Another emotionally constipated vampire who needs therapy, not a girlfriend. The reviewer, MK, the last page, had, once again, taken surgical, gleeful aim at everything he held dear. Lord Valerius was a filing cabinet. His romantic declarations sounded like ordering a subordinate into battle. The author had clearly never experienced a healthy, reciprocal relationship. Damien, king of the Carpathian Dominion, lord of the Shadowed Court, conqueror of the Ottomans at Cluj in 1588, and author of 16 best-selling paranormal romance novels, closed his laptop with a quiet, precise click. The sound echoed through the cavernous library like a period at the end of a death sentence. Alistair! A figure detached itself from the shadows near a towering shelf of 12th century theological texts. Alistair moved with the silent grace of a ghost and the profound weariness of a man who had heard that exact tone herald everything from a declaration of war to a complaint about the vintage of the O-negative. Your Majesty. His voice was as dry as untouched papyrus. Another stellar review, I take it? Damien spun his chair around, a ludicrously modern ergonomic monstrosity that clashed horribly with the Gothic grandeur of the room. Even the suits of armor flanking the fireplace seemed to disapprove. She called Lord Valerius a filing cabinet. Alistair considered this. Is he not? He is a nuanced portrayal of an immortal being grappling with centuries of loss and emotional ossification. He also declares his love by stating, and I quote, "You are mine, it is decreed." It lacks a certain finesse, Your Majesty. It's powerful. It's definitive. It's what you said to the Duke of Wallachia before you threw him from the battlements. Alistair allowed a careful pause. It is, perhaps, not peak romance. Damien surged to his feet, pacing before a stained glass window that depicted one of his ancestors looking similarly vexed. The late afternoon sun filtered through the colored glass in bands of red and gold, and where those bands touched his skin, it reddened faintly, like the beginning of a burn. He stepped out of the light without breaking stride, a movement so practiced it was unconscious. He had been dodging sunlight for 8 centuries the way most people blinked. This MK has given me 1 star for every single book. Every single one. Crimson Vows was emotionally stunted. Blood Requiem was written by someone who thinks love is a hostile takeover. And now this, a filing cabinet. A handsome block of ice, to be fair, Alistair murmured, scanning the review. She does concede the handsomeness. That is not the point. Damien stopped pacing. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. The same smile he'd worn before the Battle of Karen Sebesh, right before everything went spectacularly wrong. Alistair's internal weariness klaxon began to blare. This MK runs a bookstore, does she not? The last page. Sire, what are you contemplating? Literary discourse. I am going to find this critic, and we are going to have a spirited debate about character development. Your Majesty, Alistair said, with the tone of a man trying to talk a hurricane out of making landfall. Perhaps you could simply not read the reviews. And allow this slander to stand? Never. Damien strode towards the door, pausing only to shrug on a coat and check that the sunlight in the corridor had dimmed sufficiently. The western wing was tolerable after 4, but the gallery was a death trap until sunset. I am the Vampire King. I have toppled empires and humbled popes. I will not be defeated by a bookstore owner with a thesaurus and an unwarranted opinion. Alistair watched him go, a blur of righteous indignation in a ridiculously expensive cashmere sweater, navigating the shadows between windows with the ease of long practice. He sighed, pulling a silver flask from his coat. Well, he muttered to the empty library, this should be interesting. The last page was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos Mira curated with the loving precision of a master artist. Books were stacked on floors, crammed into shelves, and perched precariously on every available surface. The air smelled of old paper, fresh ink, and the faint cinnamon spice aroma of the tea she was perpetually brewing. She was in the middle of writing a shelf talker for a new fantasy epic. Come for the dragons, stay for the surprisingly robust economic system, when the bell over the door chimed. She didn't look up. Welcome to the last page. If you're looking for the latest bestseller, it's by the window. If you're looking for something that will change your life, it's probably in a dusty pile in the back. Don't be afraid to dig. A silence followed. Not a normal, browsing customer silence, but a heavy, charged silence. The kind of silence that usually preceded a wolf appearing in a fairy tale. The two customers near the poetry section quietly moved to the opposite side of the store without seeming to know why. Even Mrs. Henderson's Pomeranian, tied to the bench outside, whimpered once and went still. Frowning, Mira looked up and froze. The man standing by the door was, for lack of a better word, an event. He was tall, dressed in a dark gray coat that probably cost more than her store's monthly rent, and had the kind of bone structure that made you want to apologize for your own round, friendly face. His silver hair fell to his shoulders, his eyes were the color of a stormy sea, and his expression was one of intense, thunderous gravity. He looked like every single brooding, morally gray hero from every fantasy novel she had ever loved and eviscerated in a review. Everyone in the store seemed to feel it, that instinctive animal unease, the hindbrain alarm that said something in this room is a predator, and it isn't the Pomeranian. The two poetry customers had abandoned their browsing entirely and were edging toward the door. Mira felt none of it. She was, she would later reflect, either extraordinarily brave or profoundly stupid. What she actually felt was a spark of professional curiosity and a flicker of annoyance at a man who had clearly never heard of resting bitch face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her pen hovering over the card. He moved towards the counter with a fluid grace that was almost unnerving. He didn't walk so much as flow, covering the distance without a sound. "I am looking for M.K." His voice was a low, resonant baritone, like cello strings being plucked in a crypt. Crap. An angry author. It happened once every few years. Usually they were weedy poet types who'd send a flurry of passive-aggressive emails. This one looked like he might smite her with a bolt of pure aristocratic displeasure. She put down her pen and adopted a pose of casual indifference she was miles from feeling. "That's me. What can I do for you?" He placed his hands on the counter. His fingers were long and elegant, his nails immaculately clean. "You are the one-star reviewer." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. A spark of defiance lit in her chest, extinguishing the flicker of unease. Oh, she knew this type. The type who thought their art was above reproach. "Well, it depends what you're referring to. I give out a lot of one-star reviews. It's a bit of a brand." Was it the self-published werewolf erotica with the grammatical errors? Or the historical romance where the Duke of Wellington was inexplicably a secret ninja? His eyes narrowed. The stormy sea was turning into a full-blown hurricane. Auguste de Valois, Midnight's Embrace. The penny dropped. A slow, delighted grin spread across her face. "Oh, you're the author?" "I am," he bit out. "Wow." She leaned back and looked him up and down. "I have to say, this is a surprise. I always pictured Auguste de Valois as a 100-year-old shut-in, living in a crumbling French chateau with a legion of cats and a deep-seated misunderstanding of human interaction." His jaw tightened. "The chateau is not crumbling." Mira blinked. Then she burst out laughing, a loud, uninhibited sound that made a stack of paperbacks wobble. The two remaining customers fled. "Oh my God, you're serious. You're actually him." "Your criticism," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that probably worked wonders on his fictional heroines, "is unfounded." "Unfounded?" she squeaked, caught between outrage and amusement. Did you read my review? Or did you just see the single solitary star and fly into a goth rage? Your hero is a walking, talking red flag. He communicates in threats. He thinks kidnapping is a form of courtship. The man has the emotional intelligence of a toaster. He is a vampire, he roared, and for a second the word was so full of ancient power that the lights in the shop flickered and the temperature dropped 2 degrees. He caught himself, lowering his voice, a flush on his high cheekbones that he would later attribute to passion, and Alistair would attribute to embarrassment. He has lived for centuries. His ways are not your ways. Vampires can have feelings, she shot back, jabbing a finger in his direction. Read any other book in the genre. They can be tender. They can be vulnerable. They can use their words. Yours just won't. He's not a tragic, lonely figure. He's just a bully with good hair. He stared at her, utterly nonplussed. It was clear no one had spoken to him like this in a long, long time. And what he couldn't understand, what genuinely baffled him, was that she wasn't afraid. Every human in the store had felt the edge of his presence, that ancient predator pressure that made their spines straighten and their eyes look for exits. And this woman, this small, fierce creature behind a fortress of paperbacks, was jabbing her finger at him and critiquing his hair. My hair, he said, a note of deep offense in his voice, is irrelevant to the literary merit of my work. Is it? Because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for Lord Valerius's personality. They stared at each other across the counter, a battlefield of worn wood and book dust. He was magnificent in his fury, a living archetype of the very thing she critiqued. And she, apparently, was the first person in his long, dramatic life to call him on his nonsense. This is not over, he said, his voice a low promise. Oh, I hope not, she said, her eyes sparkling. I haven't had this much fun all year. Same time tomorrow? He looked baffled, as though he'd come for a duel and she'd invited him to tea. What? To argue. You're clearly not done, and I am absolutely dying to hear your defense for the scene where Valerius locks the heroine in a tower for her own safety. I've got notes. It's a whole section of my review, actually. I called it, Incarceration is Not a Love Language. He stared at her for a moment longer, his mind, which had processed the fall of empires, seemingly unable to process her. Then, without another word, he turned and swept out of the store. The bell chimed mockingly in his wake. Mira leaned back against the shelves, a wide grin on her face. She picked up her pen. Underneath, Come for the dragons, stay for the surprisingly robust economic system, she added a new line. P.S. Way better than Midnight's Embrace. Her phone buzzed, a text from her landlord. Rent increase effective next quarter. Sorry, Mira. It's the market. She stared at it, the grin fading. It was the third increase in 2 years. Sales were down 12%. Online was eating her alive. She put the phone face down on the counter and went back to the shelf talker, the words not coming as easily as before. The dragons and their robust economic system stared back at her, unhelpfully. Chapter 2. Remedial Human Interaction. He came back the next day. Mira was shelving a new shipment of biographies when the bell chimed. She knew it was him without even looking. There was a certain atmospheric pressure drop that accompanied his presence, as if the air itself was bracing for impact. The 2 regulars by the window got up and left, clutching their coffees, looking vaguely unsettled. He was standing by the romance section, holding a copy of a book with a shirtless man on the cover. He was holding it with 2 fingers, as if it were a soiled diaper. Good morning, Mira said cheerfully, sliding a biography of Marie Curie into place. Come to yell at me about the tower scene? I am not yelling. I am engaging in vigorous intellectual debate. Right, and I'm just a humble purveyor of literature. So, what's your defense? Fire away. He put the offending book down with a shudder. Lord Valerius was protecting her. The village was full of his enemies. The tower was the most secure location in the castle. He didn't tell her that, Mira countered, turning to face him, a stack of books in her arms. He just grabbed her, threw her over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, and said, and I quote, "You will remain where I command." That's not protection, that's imprisonment. A simple conversation would have solved the entire conflict. Darling, my nemesis, Vlad the annoyingly persistent, is in town. I'd like you to stay in the North Tower for a bit. It has lovely views, and I'll have refreshments sent up. See? Communication. It's a game changer. He stared at her. Vlad, the annoyingly persistent? Work with me here, she said, gesturing with a biography of Einstein. The point is, your hero doesn't talk, he dictates. He doesn't ask, he commands. Love is a partnership, not a hostile takeover. Love is a vulnerability he cannot afford, Damien said, his voice softer than before, and for a moment, the author was gone, and someone ancient and tired was looking out of his eyes. Then why is he in a romance novel? Mira asked, her own voice softening in response. If he can't be vulnerable, he shouldn't be the hero. He should be the villain. A compelling, tragic villain maybe, but the villain nonetheless. The argument went on for 3 hours. They moved from the tower scene to the cringe-worthy poetry Valerius wrote in the 17th century, to the moment he gifted the heroine a cursed amulet as a sign of his eternal claim. It's a tracking device, Mira shrieked, laughing. You gave your heroine a supernatural ankle monitor and called it a love token. It was enchanted to protect her, he thundered. You could have just given her a really nice scarf. By the time he left, Mira was exhausted and exhilarated. He never introduced himself by his real name, and she never asked. He was just Auguste, the ridiculously handsome, infuriatingly obtuse author who was quickly becoming the most interesting part of her week. He came back the next day, and the next. Their arguments became a fixture of the store. Her regulars, the ones who'd learned to tolerate the faint unease that came with his presence, chalking it up to strong energy, or probably just needs to eat something, would see his expensive car pull up and give her knowing smiles. They'd wander to the back of the store, pretending to browse the history section, but she knew they were listening. A healthy relationship requires mutual respect, not just fear-induced obedience. He has lived for 800 years. His perspective is necessarily different. That's not an excuse for being a jerk. It's just a reason. It occurred to her, somewhere around the 3rd visit, that an author this reclusive, this eccentric, this physically incapable of eating a pastry or drinking a glass of water, who arrived exclusively in late afternoon or evening, whose presence made dogs cower and customers instinctively flee, was checking rather a lot of boxes from the very genre they kept arguing about. She dismissed the thought. She had been reviewing vampire fiction for so long that she was seeing capes in every shadow. He was just a strange, dramatic man who took his author persona too seriously. People in publishing were weird. It was basically a job requirement. Somewhere between their 4th and 5th argument, the dynamic began to shift. He started asking questions. So, he'd said one afternoon, looking genuinely perplexed, if locking her in a tower is incorrect, what is the appropriate response to a perceived threat against one's beloved? Mira had blinked, taken aback by the genuine query beneath the literary framing. You ask her what she wants to do. You present the options. You face the threat together, as a team. A team, he repeated, as if the word was a foreign delicacy he was tasting for the first time. Another day, he picked up a contemporary romance. This book, he said with disdain. The hero apologizes 4 times. And? He did nothing wrong. The misunderstanding was her fault. She failed to communicate her needs clearly. Mira sighed, putting down her mug. Okay, author man. Lesson 1 in remedial human interaction. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. It matters that the other person is hurt. A good apology isn't about admitting fault. It's about acknowledging pain. I'm sorry you're hurting. I'm sorry my actions contributed to that. How can I make it right? It's not that hard. He was silent for a long time, staring at the book. I see, he said finally. though he looked like she'd just explained quantum physics using only interpretive dance. One rainy Tuesday, he found her looking glum. Sales were down again. The rent increase notice was taped to her register like a warrant, and her leaky roof had dripped onto a first edition of The Hobbit. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply disappeared for an hour and returned with 2 cups of what smelled like the most divine hot chocolate on earth, and a box of pastries from the fancy bakery down the street. He set them on the counter without ceremony. Mira stared at them. "I thought you didn't do human food." She'd noticed early on he never ate or drank anything. Not a sip of water, not a polite nibble. "I do not," he said simply, "but you looked as though you required it." He gestured to the steaming mug. "I am told this is a superior blend." "How would you know?" "I interrogated the barista," he said, with the gravity of a spy master detailing a mission. "I described your general state of despondency and demanded the most effective chocolate-based antidote." He seemed to understand. Mira laughed, a real, watery laugh. She took a sip. It was divine. She looked at him, this strange, impossible man, who argued with her about fictional vampires and bought her hot chocolate he couldn't drink, who made every customer in a 10-foot radius instinctively nervous, and who couldn't tell that the woman behind the counter wasn't afraid of him at all. She was afraid of something much more mundane. She was afraid of losing this, the store, the books, the smell of old paper, the life she'd built, word by word, shelf by shelf, that the world was quietly deciding it no longer needed. "Thank you, August," she said softly. He gave a stiff, almost awkward nod. "The emotional well-being of my chief antagonist is paramount to the quality of our discourse." But his eyes were soft, and his hand, resting on the counter, was close enough to hers that she could feel the cool absence of warmth radiating from his skin. She didn't move her hand away. And she noticed, or thought she noticed, that he didn't either. Chapter 3. Blackwood Manor. The day Damien decided to invite Mira to the castle, it started, as most things did, with an argument. "My world-building is impeccable," he declared. "I draw from centuries of lived experience. The textures, the politics, the crushing weight of eternity, it is all authentic." "Authentic to you, maybe," Mira countered, perched on a stool. "To the reader, it just feels remote, cold. You write about your castle, but it doesn't feel like a home. It feels like a stage set for a tragedy." A terrible, brilliant idea sparked in his mind. "Very well. I am inviting you to my home, this Saturday. I will show you that my world is exactly as I have written it." Mira stared at him. "And why exactly would I do that?" "Because you are insatiably curious. You cannot resist." He had her there. Damn him. "Fine, but if you have a portrait that watches me, or a crazed wife locked in the attic, I'm calling an Uber and giving you a 0-star review on Yelp." The car was a sleek black Bentley with windows so darkly tinted they were essentially opaque. The driver was Stefan, a silent man who looked like he could snap a person in half and then feel vaguely disappointed that it hadn't been more of a challenge. The country estate was a full-blown, honest-to-God castle, complete with towers, battlements, and what looked suspiciously like a moat. It rose from the mist-shrouded hills like a jagged black tooth. Holy mother of every Gothic novel I have ever read, Mira thought as they pulled up to a massive, iron-studded wooden door. This is either going to be the best weekend of my life or a really atmospheric murder. Either way, excellent content for the blog. She noticed they'd entered through a covered stone archway. No sunlight in the passage, no sunlight in the courtyard. The architectural choices of the castle were starting to make a very specific kind of sense. Between the blackout Bentley and the sunless courtyard, the boxes she'd been dismissing at the bookstore were being checked again, louder this time. She pushed the thought down. Dramatic author, dramatic house, that was all. Damien was waiting in the great hall. The ceiling soared into darkness. Tapestries depicting brutal battles hung on stone walls. Suits of armor stood sentinel. A fireplace the size of a small car roared with a fire that did little to warm the cavernous space. He was standing at the top of a grand staircase, dressed in black, of course. He looked exactly like his hero, Lord Valerius, dramatic, remote, and utterly terrifying. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," he said, his voice echoing. Okay, so the crumbling chateau theory was off. This thing is structurally sound as hell, and he's nailed the brooding immortal aesthetic. 10 points for production design. Minus 1 million for livability. This place has the cozy charm of a medieval tax audit. "Your books call it Castle Volkov," she said. "You changed the name." "A small literary license, to deter tourists." "Right. Wouldn't want hordes of people in fanny packs ruining the ambiance." He led her upstairs, down a corridor so long she was fairly certain they'd crossed a time zone. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, all of whom shared his dramatic bone structure and looked deeply disappointed in her sweater and jeans. Every window they passed had blackout curtains drawn tight, and where a curtain had shifted slightly, she could see the frame was reinforced, heavy UV filtering glass. Not decorative, functional. 1 star for the interior design, she thought. 5 stars for commitment to a theme. He stopped before a heavy oak door. The room within was surprisingly nice, a 4-poster bed, a cheerful fireplace, shelves of books. She stepped inside and turned back. He was still standing on the threshold. "Are you coming in?" she asked. A strange expression crossed his face. "You have to, the protocol. You must grant me leave to enter." Mira stared at him. And then the penny dropped. The invitation. He couldn't enter a private dwelling unless invited. By stepping inside, she had claimed it. The sheer absurdity hit her like a freight train. This ancient, powerful creature, master of this ridiculously oversized castle, was locked out of a room in his own house by a rule from a fairy tale. She bit her lip. The temptation to say no was almost overwhelming. "Come in, you ridiculous man," she said. His entire body relaxed. "That counts," he muttered, stepping over the threshold with the relief of a man who'd just been pardoned. His gaze fell on the large, gilt-edged mirror over the mantelpiece, or rather, on the absence in it. The mirror showed the room, the fire, the bed, and an empty space where he was standing. He instinctively ran a hand through his hair. "How do I look?" he asked, then froze, horror dawning on his face as he realized what he'd just done. 800 years without a reflection. He relied on portraits, on the reactions of others, and, she suspected, on Alistair. The question wasn't vanity. It was a genuine request for information from a man who hadn't seen his own face since the Crusades. The boxes she had been ignoring all day, the ones from the bookstore, the tinted windows, the sunless courtyard, the fleeing customers, the not eating, the not drinking, the cold skin, the invitation rule, and now the mirror, every single one of them burst open at once. The genre expert who had read 300 vampire novels could no longer pretend she didn't know what she was looking at. Her planned sarcastic retort died in her throat, not because of fear, because of the loneliness of it. The sheer, staggering loneliness of a man who hadn't seen his own face in 800 years. "You look," she said softly, "like you own the place." Something shifted in his expression. Not annoyance, not curiosity. Something closer to surprise. And maybe gratitude. She didn't say what she had figured out. Not yet. She filed it away in the part of her brain that wrote reviews, the part that could hold an observation without flinching. She would need more than a missing reflection and a set of dramatic coincidences. She would need him to tell her himself. And she suspected, with the certainty of a woman who had spent her life reading between lines, that he was working up to it. Dinner was an exercise in exquisite, soul-crushing awkwardness. The dining hall could have seated the entire U.S. Senate with room for their aides. Mira sat at one end of a table that stretched into the dim distance, and Damien sat at the other. Silent, unnervingly pale staff brought course after course of incredible food. This is what Yelp reviews for haunted castles must feel like, Mira thought, swallowing a bite of perfectly roasted quail. 5 stars for the food, 1 star for the ambiance. Would recommend only if you're comfortable eating alone in a room the size of an aircraft hangar while a handsome man watches you chew from 40 feet away. The staff have the customer service warmth of a DMV staffed entirely by people who've been dead since the Renaissance. Damien sat ramrod straight, a single glass of deep red liquid at his elbow, and watched her. He didn't eat, he just observed. "This is the most uncomfortable meal of my life," she said, putting her fork down. "I feel like I'm being graded on my chewing. Come on, sit closer." The seating arrangement is dictated by centuries of protocol. The head of the table is here, the guest of honor is there. The guest of honor feels like she needs a telescope to talk to her host. Forget protocol, scoot. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of ages, he stood. He picked up his chair, a massive, throne-like piece of carved oak that must have weighed 100 pounds, and moved it across from her with no discernible effort. Henri, watching from the kitchen doorway, looked like he was about to have a conniption. Apparently, the seating chart had survived the Ottoman Empire, but could not survive an Ohio bookstore owner. "So, what is that?" she asked, nodding at his glass. "A private vintage, O-negative, 1982. A very good year. Notes of melancholy and poor life choices." Mira choked on her wine. "You're kidding!" Blood sommelier culture is a rich and fascinating field. You would be appalled at the swill most modern vampires consume. Bags. It is the vin de table of our kind, utterly without character. She stared at him. He was insane. Utterly, magnificently, completely insane. And she was having the time of her life. After dinner, the library. It was the heart of the castle, and clearly the heart of him. 3 stories high, spiraling iron staircases, books packed into every inch. The air smelled of leather and vanilla and thyme. This room felt like a home. His home. "Wow," Mira breathed. "This is heaven." "It is merely a collection of paper," he said, but there was pride in his voice as deep and old as the foundations. They talked for hours. Not argued, talked. About books, about stories, about the characters they loved and the ones they hated. He showed her a first edition Shakespeare. She showed him how to find a book on her e-reader app, a device he regarded with the suspicion of a man who remembered the printing press. "You carry an entire library in a glowing rectangle?" he marveled. "Welcome to the future, author man." It was late when a yawn cracked her jaw. "I think my dwelling is calling me." He looked at her, and the ancient weariness was back. "Ah, yes, sleep. I remember sleep." "You don't sleep? Ever?" "We do not require it. We rest, we think, we remember. For 800 years, I have not had a moment of true unconsciousness." All those hours, all those nights, alone with his thoughts, century after century in the quiet. No wonder his heroes were broody. He'd had 800 years to practice. "That sounds awful," she said honestly. "It is merely quiet," he said, and the word sat between them, enormous, because she heard what it actually meant. Lonely. He walked her to her room. At the door, he hesitated. "I enjoyed our discourse," he said. "Me too. Even the part where you called my favorite poet a sentimental hack." "He is," Damien insisted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Good night, Mira." "Good night, August." She paused at the door. "Or whatever your real name is." He went very still. "When you figure it out," she said gently, "and we both know I already have, you can tell me yourself. I'd rather hear it from you than guess." She closed the door before he could answer, and she heard him stand in the corridor for a very long time, not breathing, because of course he didn't need to, processing the fact that she had known, or nearly known, and had still said goodnight instead of goodbye. On the other side of the door, Damien stood in the silent corridor. He could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing as she settled into sleep. He had commanded armies, held the lives of thousands in his hands, but he had never really listened to someone sleep. It sounded peaceful, a peace he had long forgotten. Alistair found him there. "Spying on the guest, Your Majesty?" "I am ensuring her safety." "Of course. She is a terrifyingly dangerous woman. The way she wields sarcasm, a true threat to the realm." Damien finally turned. "She's not afraid of me, Alistair." A pause. This was, they both understood, significant. Every human felt it, the aura, the ancient predator weight of his presence. It was biological. It was unavoidable. Except, apparently, it was. "No," Alistair agreed quietly. "She is not. She thinks my heroes are bullies." "They are. She knows what I am. She hasn't said it, but she knows. And she's still here." Alistair's expression softened. "Then perhaps the question is not whether she will stay. It is whether you will let her." Damien didn't answer. He just looked at the door, behind which a mortal woman slept, dreaming dreams he could never have. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence of his castle felt less like peace and more like an empty cage. Chapter 4. The Monster and the Closing. The next morning, Mira woke to the smell of coffee and a note in elegant, spiky script. "I was informed this is the customary ritual. Do not feel obligated to consume the pastry. Henri was experimenting, and I fear he may have been overzealous with the butter. ADV." 5 stars, Henri, she thought, biting into the most transcendently buttery croissant of her life. "I'm leaving Auguste for you. We'll run away together and open a bakery and never discuss character development again." She found Damien in the library, glaring at a blank laptop screen with an expression of intense personal hatred. "What's wrong? Staring down the blank page?" "I am attempting to redraft a chapter. The hero, Lord Kalen, has just discovered the heroine has been secretly meeting with his sworn enemy. Let me guess. He confronts her, drags her back to his lair, and locks her in the dungeon for her own good." His jaw tightened. "That was the original draft, yes." "Called it." They spent the morning workshopping the scene. Mira taught him about fear disguised as anger, about apologies that cost something, about the difference between declaring love and demonstrating it. He listened with the fierce concentration of a man dismantling centuries of bad habits, one sentence at a time. He finally stopped typing and read what he'd written. He looked up at her, his expression one of dawning wonder. "It is better," he admitted. "It's good," she said softly. "It's really good." Their faces were close. She could see the flecks of silver in his stormy gray eyes, the faint lines etched at the corners from centuries of not smiling. He smelled of old books and night air and something else, something cool and electric and entirely him. The space between them felt like a held breath. A cough from the doorway. Duchess Genevieve swept into the library like a black swan in a hurricane, tall, ethereally beautiful, hair the color of spun moonlight, eyes the color of amethysts and the warmth of January. "Damien, darling," she purred, placing a possessive hand on his arm. Her gaze raked over Mira. "How quaint. You have a pet." "She is a literary consultant," Damien said tightly, detaching her hand. "A consultant." Genevieve turned to Mira, and her voice dropped to something that was not quite a threat and not quite a whisper. "And what do you consult him on, little mortal? How to use a fork?" "I'm teaching him how to write a hero who isn't a complete emotional void," Mira said sweetly. "It's a long-term project." Genevieve steered them to the gallery. She clung to Damien's arm, pointing out portraits and making comments with the precision of a stiletto. She paused before a portrait of a beautiful woman with sad eyes. "And this must be Isabella, the human girl you were so fond of back in the 1600s. Such a shame what happened to her." "What happened to her?" Mira couldn't help but ask. "She got old," Genevieve cruel little smile. "They always do." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Mira looked at Damien. His face was stone, but his eyes were fixed on the portrait, and in their depths she saw a flicker of ancient, bottomless pain. The pain of outliving everyone you ever cared about. And suddenly it all clicked. The emotionally stunted heroes, the fear of vulnerability, the obsession with control. He wasn't a bad writer because he didn't understand emotion. He was a bad writer because he understood it too well. He understood loss so profoundly that he couldn't bear to write a happy ending he knew was a lie. Because for him, every love story had the same ending. She got old, she died, he remained. "You know what?" Mira said, her voice ringing with confidence. "I think I've seen enough art. August, you promised me you'd show me the kitchens. I want to meet Henri. I want to ask him if he has any garlic." The look of synchronized horror on Damien's and Genevieve's faces was worth the trip. She dragged a stunned Damien out of the gallery. "Thank you," he murmured. "Don't thank me yet. We have work to do." She looked up at him. "We're going to fix your book, and we're going to give Lord Kalen something you've never dared to give any of your heroes." "And what is that?" "A happy ending. A real one." 3 months later, Mira unlocked the door to the last page on a Tuesday morning and found 2 things: a leak in the ceiling that had warped an entire shelf of paperbacks, and a letter from her landlord. She read it twice. The words didn't change. The building was being sold. The new owner was converting to retail office hybrid. She had 60 days. She sat behind the counter for a long time, holding the letter. The store was quiet. It had been quiet a lot lately. Fewer customers, fewer sales. The world was moving on, migrating to screens and algorithms and 2-day shipping. And the last page, her last page, her whole stupid, beautiful, irrelevant life was being left behind. When Damien arrived that evening, she was sitting in the dark. "The power is off?" he asked, confused. "I forgot to turn on the lights." Her voice was flat. She handed him the letter. He read it with preternatural speed. "This is unacceptable. I will purchase the building." "No. It is a simple financial transaction. I will have Alistair—" "I said no!" The sharpness in her voice stopped him. She stood, and all the fear and grief she'd been swallowing for months came pouring out, and it found the most convenient target in the room, the man who would never lose anything to time. "You don't get to fix this, Auguste. You don't get to swoop in with your bottomless bank account and your 800-year investment portfolio and make it go away. This is my store, my life, and it's dying. And you literally can't understand what that feels like, because nothing of yours ever dies. You just go on, forever, accumulating castles and first editions and centuries, and the rest of us are just temporary. We're Isabella. We're the painting on the wall. We're the thing you look at and feel sad about for a century or two before you move on to the next one." The words hit him like physical blows. She could see it, the way he absorbed each one, the way his face went from confusion to understanding, to a pain so raw it looked like she'd reached into his chest and squeezed. "Is that what you think?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That you are temporary to me?" "I think everything is temporary to you," she said, and the worst part was that she wasn't angry anymore. She was just tired. "And I think I can't keep standing in this dying shop, arguing about fictional vampires with a man who will still be here when the building is rubble and I'm a name on a stone. I can't do it." She turned away. "Please go." He stood there for a long moment, and then, for the first time in the history of their acquaintance, he did what she asked without argument. He left. The bell chimed, and the shop was silent. 3 days passed. Mira packed boxes. She didn't cry. She organized the inventory with the meticulous care of a surgeon, because if she stopped being efficient, she would fall apart. On the 3rd night, she was alone in the store, taping up a box of first editions, when she heard the back door crack. She froze. The sound was wrong. Not a knock, not a key. The sound of wood giving way under force. A man came through the stockroom doorway. He was big, jittery, and his eyes moved too fast. Behind him, a second figure. "Register," the first one said. "Now." Mira's hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. The register had $40 in it. The rare books in the box at her feet were worth $10,000. "Okay," she said, raising her hands. "Okay, I'll open it." She never got to the register. The lights went out. Not flickered, went out, as if the building's electricity had been seized by a fist and crushed. The temperature dropped so sharply she could see her breath, and then something moved in the dark. It was fast, faster than anything she had ever seen. There was a sound she would never forget, like the air being torn in half. One of the men screamed, not shouted, screamed, high and thin, a sound of absolute primal terror. Something hit the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. The second man tried to run and made it 3 steps before he was simply stopped. She heard the thud. She heard the whimper, and then silence. The lights came back on. Damien was standing in the middle of her shop, and he was not the man she knew. His eyes were black, not dark gray, not stormy sea, but black. The pupils dilated until there was no iris, no white, just an ancient abyssal darkness that had nothing to do with humanity. His lips were pulled back from teeth that were longer than they should have been. The 2 men were crumpled on the floor, unconscious. One slumped against the cracked wall, the other at his feet. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, she realized, but from restraint. He was holding himself back. He turned to her, and for a terrible, frozen moment, she didn't see August. She didn't see the man who bought her hot chocolate and argued about fictional feelings and couldn't enter a room without permission. She saw the thing that had made empires kneel. She saw the predator. She saw what 8 centuries of darkness and blood and power actually looked like when the mask came off. He saw the fear in her eyes. And the sound he made, a low, wrecked sound, barely human, was the most vulnerable thing she had ever heard from him. "Mira," he said, and his voice was rough, wrong, the voice of something trying very hard to be a person. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered. She was shaking, not from the break-in, from him, from what he was. He looked at the men on the floor, then at his own hands. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were gray again, human passing. The teeth had receded. But the after-image of what she'd seen was burned into her vision like a flashbulb. "I will go," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "I should not have. I was outside. I have been near the store every night since you told me to leave because I could not just—" He stopped, swallowed. "I heard your heartbeat change, and He looked at her the way a man looks at something precious that he has just broken. "Please don't be afraid of me," he said. And it was not a command. It was not a decree. It was a plea, and it cost him everything. Mira stood in her ruined shop, surrounded by cracked plaster and scattered books, looking at the monster who had just saved her life. The monster who was begging her not to be afraid. She didn't answer. He left. The bell didn't chime this time. He moved too fast for it. Behind him, in the dark, Alistair materialized from the shadows like a sigh given form. He looked at the 2 unconscious men, the cracked wall, the scattered books. He pulled out his phone. "Stefan," he said, "bring the car around to the back. And the zip ties. His Majesty has made a mess again." He glanced at the men. They would wake up in an alley 6 blocks away with splitting headaches, no memory of the last hour, and a profound, inexplicable desire to never go near a bookstore again. The veil, the old accord that kept the human world ignorant of the world beneath it, required a certain amount of maintenance. Alistair had been handling the maintenance for 600 years. Two more unconscious mortals were barely a footnote. Chapter 5. 5 stars. 1 week. 1 week of silence. 1 week of Mira packing boxes in a store that was closing, replaying the scene over and over. The black eyes, the speed, the teeth. The sound of a man hitting a wall hard enough to crater the plaster. And then, please don't be afraid of me. She thought about Isabella in the portrait, the woman who got old. She thought about the look on Damien's face when Genevieve had said it, that flicker of ancient, bottomless pain. She thought about the hot chocolate, the croissant, the library, the mirror. How do I look? She thought about the fact that he had been standing outside her store every night since she'd told him to go, not because he was controlling, not because he was possessive, but because he couldn't stop protecting someone he loved even when she'd told him she didn't want him there. She thought about her bookstore, closing, about the world moving on, about being temporary, being irrelevant, being the thing that time forgets, and she thought, he was afraid of that too. Not of being forgotten, he could never be forgotten, but of being alone, of outliving everything he touched, of being the one who remained, staring at portraits of people who had once been warm and were now just paint. She wasn't afraid of the monster. She was afraid of the same thing he was, of loving something that time would take away. The difference was, he'd been living with that fear for 800 years. And he'd still come running when her heart rate changed. She picked up her phone. "You owe me a wall," she texted the number he'd given her months ago, in case she ever needed to reach Auguste for literary consultations. The reply came in 4 seconds. "I will have it repaired immediately. I will also replace the damaged inventory. I have already contacted—" "That's not what I meant," she typed. "Come to the store, please." He came at dusk, when the light was low enough that the walk from his car to the door wouldn't burn. She noticed that now, the way he planned his movements around the sun, the careful choreography of a life lived in the margins of daylight. How had she never seen it before? She had, she realized. She'd just called it dramatic. He stood in the doorway, and he looked terrible. Not in the way humans look terrible. He was still devastatingly handsome, because apparently 8 centuries of insomnia couldn't produce a single under-eye bag. But his eyes were hollow in a way that had nothing to do with physiology. He looked like a man who had been awake for a week with nothing but his worst thoughts for company. Which, she realized, was exactly what he was. "Hi," she said. "Hello?" His voice was careful, measured, as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile thing had brought her to text him. "You look terrible." "I have not seen a mirror in 800 years. I will have to take your word for it." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. His eyes widened slightly. Hope was a dangerous thing on the face of a man who had lived long enough to know better. "Come in," she said, and they both heard it, the invitation, freighted with more than its words. He stepped over the threshold. They stood in the half-empty store, surrounded by boxes and bare shelves. The place looked like it was already a ghost of itself. "I'm closing the store," she said. "Not because you can fix it. I'm closing it because it's time." The world moved on, and I was too stubborn to notice. She took a breath. "But I'm not closing me. I'm not done. I just need to figure out what comes next." "Mira, I'm not finished." She stepped closer. "I saw what you are. I saw the eyes and the teeth and I saw the guy in the wall. And I was scared." He flinched. "For about 30 seconds, she continued. "And then I was scared of something else. I was scared that you'd never come back. That I'd pushed you away with the things I said, the temporary thing, the Isabella thing. And you'd decide I was right. And you'd go back to your castle and your silence and spend another century writing terrible romance novels about love being a hostile takeover." "They are not terrible," he said reflexively, and then, "They are somewhat terrible." "They're getting better, that's the point. You're getting better. Because you're trying. Because some insane bookstore owner yelled at you about filing cabinets and you actually listened." She was close to him now, close enough to feel the cool air that surrounded him. close enough to see that his hands, hanging at his sides, were trembling. The Vampire King's hands were shaking. "I am what you saw," he said quietly. "I cannot change that. I will always be that. The darkness, the hunger, I am a predator, Mira. I have done things over 8 centuries that would—" "I know. You don't. You can't." "Then tell me. Not now. Over time. Give me the 800 years one Tuesday at a time, in a shop or a library or wherever we end up. I can take it. I'm not Isabella. I'm not a painting on a wall." "No," he whispered. "You are not." She reached up and touched his face. His skin was cool, but he leaned into her hand like it was the first warmth he'd felt in a century. Maybe it was. "I don't want to be temporary, Auguste," she said. "Not to you. Not to anyone." He understood what she was saying. His eyes searched hers, not with the predator's gaze, but with something raw and human and desperately hopeful. "What you are asking, it is not a small thing. It is not reversible. You would be leaving behind everything you—" "I know what I'd be leaving." Her voice was steady. "Sunlight, growing old, the way food tastes when you're actually hungry, my mother's face when she realizes I stopped aging." She swallowed. "I've thought about it. Every night this week, I've thought about nothing else. And I'm not pretending it doesn't cost anything, because it costs everything. But my bookstore is closing. My lease is up. My world is already changing. I get to decide what it changes into." "You would be choosing the dark," he said. "I'd be choosing you," she corrected. "And your ridiculous castle, and your temperamental ghost chef, and your extremely judgmental advisor, and your deeply questionable literary output. The dark is just the commute." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, if it hadn't been wrapped around something that sounded suspiciously like a sob. The Vampire King, conqueror of the Ottomans at Cluj, was undone by a woman who was not afraid of him. He took her hand from his face and held it, carefully, as if she were made of glass and centuries. "Then I have to tell you my name," he said. "My real name, not Auguste." "I know it's not Auguste. No one named Auguste would wear that much cashmere." "It's Damien." She tested it. "Damien." She wrinkled her nose. "Very on brand." "I did not choose it," he said, affronted. "I was born in 1224. Naming conventions were limited." "Damien," she said again, and this time it was soft and real. And it was the first time in a very long time that his name had sounded like it belonged to a person rather than a title. She kissed him. It was soft and a little hesitant, and it tasted of coffee and old paper and the start of a new story. His hands came up to her face, cool and careful, and he kissed her back with the terrified gentleness of a man who had forgotten how to hold something without breaking it. The next book came out 6 months later. It was called The Sunstone Vow. Mira read her copy in a room in Blackwood Manor, her room now, the one she'd claimed, the one he still asked permission to enter every single time, even though she'd told him the standing invitation was permanent. He asked anyway. She suspected he always would. Lord Kalin was still broody, still dramatic, but this time, when he found the heroine meeting with his enemy, he didn't lock her away. He told her he was afraid. He listened. They fought, but they fought together. He apologized, properly, thoroughly, on his knees. The groveling was magnificent, and the ending. The heroine chose to stay, not because she was swept away or supernaturally compelled, but because she looked at the darkness and the centuries and the monster underneath the man and said, "Yes, this one, all of it." Mira closed the book. A tear traced down her cheek. She logged into her blog. 5 stars. Title: He finally got it right. Review: I have been reviewing Auguste de Valois' work for years, and I have never given him more than 2 stars. Today I am giving him 5, and I want to be clear about why. It's not because this book is perfect. It's not. The hero is still dramatic to the point of absurdity. The world building assumes you're familiar with the previous 16 books, and there is a blood sommelier scene that I'm not sure is meant to be funny, but had me crying with laughter. But for the first time, the hero earns it. He earns the heroine, he earns the ending. He does the work, the real, ugly, terrifying work of being vulnerable with another person. And the result is a love story that feels true. Not perfect, true. The author, whoever he really is, has finally learned something that none of his 8 centuries of experience could teach him. That the point of a love story isn't the forever. It's the choosing. Signed, M.K. She closed her laptop. The castle was quiet around her, the old, deep quiet she was learning to love rather than fear. Footsteps in the corridor, a pause at the door. "May I come in?" Damien asked, because he always asked. "Always," she said, because she always answered. He entered, holding a copy of the book. He looked at her, and his eyes, gray, human, his, were full of something he was still learning to name. 5 stars, he said. You earned them. He sat beside her on the bed. His hand found hers, cool against warm, ancient against new. The beginning of something that would last a very long time. "The blog name," he said. "The next chapter." "I thought it was appropriate." She leaned against his shoulder. "Seeing as I'm going through some changes." "You are certain?" he asked. And the question held everything, the weight of it, the permanence, the dark and the centuries, and the things he had done, and the things he would never stop being. "I wrote a 5-star review, Damien. I don't do that lightly." She tilted her face up to his. "Now stop asking and kiss me before Alistair finds an excuse to interrupt." From somewhere deep in the castle, the sound of a silver flask being opened, and a dry, papyrus-thin voice murmuring to no one in particular. Well, it only took him 800 years.